All right, so I think we're gonna go ahead and get started now, and people will trickle in as they will. Bear with me, this is our first fully digital artist talk we've done while having it also be in person. Don't mind the flashbacks to COVID. This is just a wonderful, like, kind of technological chance we have here. My name is Tim Stark. I am the gallery coordinator for the Harold J. Miossi Art Gallery here at Cuesta College, and it is my pleasure tonight to welcome you all to Daisy Patton's artist talk for her current show, Before These Witnesses, that's currently on display at the Harold J. Miossi Art Gallery. I'm going to try and talk to both the web and to the audience at the same time, so I'm going to be turning a little bit back and forth. This is the part where I get to talk about the artists and how much I've enjoyed working with them. And Daisy is a really special artist for me. I've known Daisy for a very long time, for about 15 years, and I've followed her career as she's really kind of come out of grad school and grown as an artist, and had exhibits, all over the place and done really, really well. The thing I always mention about Daisy's work is that Daisy is a ferocious maker. She is someone who will never be deterred in her creation and her act of art making. And I think that is very apparent in her work in the gallery, which is all new for this show, and in her catalog, which is extensive and impressive and ferociously colorful. Someone who's never afraid to try new color combinations to the best of her success. A little about Daisy. Daisy was born in Los Angeles, California, and so she is kind of from California, if not of California anymore. And she went to school in Oklahoma, at the University of Oklahoma, and then she went to graduate school at the School of Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, which is where I met Daisy many years ago. Daisy has had extensive exhibitions, and I suggest that you read her bio and her CV that's in the gallery to go through and see it. And she's been wonderfully productive in that work. A couple of highlights are the two galleries that she's represented by, which is Kent Contemporary in Denver, Colorado, and Koslov Larson in Houston, Texas. Daisy recently opened a show at UMass Amherst in Western Massachusetts. She also resides in Western Massachusetts and is having an upcoming show soon in North Carolina at a university there as well. Her work has been exhibited all over the world, and it's my pleasure to welcome Daisy. So I'm going to pass it off to her now. She's going to be speaking to you through the magic of the internet. And then at the end of this, we will have question and answer chance for both everybody joining us online and everybody joining us here in the auditorium. So without further ado, Daisy Patton, everybody.
Yay. Thank you so much, Tim, for that introduction. I want to thank you so much for inviting me to come and have this exhibition, the Cuesta College community. I'm so grateful for all of you present and your support and care with my work. Tim, we've known each other for 17 years. I mean, technically 16 and a half, you want to be really pedantic. We met in 2008, and it just, I did the math and it made me cry a little bit inside. That's fine. We're all ancient now. Let me get my little PowerPoint here started and go through some of this here. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the Forgetting Is So Long series. The show Before These Witnesses is sort of another iteration, a series within series of that body of work. That series began in 2014, which the 10-year anniversary actually was last June. And so a little bit of a personal background, as Tim mentioned, I'm from Los Angeles. My father is Iranian, although I never met him. And I grew up with my mother as a single parent. My sister, my younger sister, had a different father who was from Belize and is Black. And so we were a very interesting sort of household. And then my mom decided to move us to Oklahoma for inexplicable reasons. And that sort of childhood growing up, I did come back actually to the middle of the state, Bakersfield, for 2 years of high school, and then finished out the rest in Oklahoma. So in any case, I have a back and forth and this sort of connection with this idea of like absence and presence, missing family members, that sort of thing. So in 2014, and this is the first painting in the series, which is why it's on the screen there. In Christmas of 2013, I became estranged from my mother for some difficult reasons, and that estrangement lasted for 2 years. And so at that point, I had finished my graduate program. At this point, I was living in Colorado and was working on a series called A Reconstructed Family Reunion, where I was basically taking my family photographs and painting them as realistic paintings and inserting a father's presence into them. So trying to imagine this sort of alternate timeline or reality where he was present. And so I was already sort of thinking about these ideas around like families and missing and all of that sort of stuff. So when the estrangement happened, I felt, quite unmoored. And then one fateful day, I was in Denver at some boutique somewhere, just, looking around, and saw a box of family photographs that were for sale, and immediately had this sort of loss of kinship connection with those photographs. And, my background in photography, I'd always been a painter and then had a painting block that began the year before I graduated from my BFA, and it lasted for 8 years, which included all the way through graduate school pretty much. But I had a very substantial background in photo and photo theory. And so the two combining them together made a lot of sense for me. And that's how this series began. So the Forgetting Is So Long series is where I'm taking abandoned or discarded family photographs that I enlarge to life size and paint over them with oil paint. So, they're very much about memory, identity, loss, that sort of thing. As you can see, I did work on weddings before the painting on the left there. The photographs that I collect, I source from a variety of places. Now it's predominantly online. In the past, I would also go to flea markets, antique stores, that sort of thing. And, basically thinking about Roland Barthes and his idea of punctum, or something that pierces him when he looks at a photograph. For me, it's a sort of process of falling in love, where I'm looking at someone and, perhaps there's a gesture or something about their pose or the surroundings around them that makes me choose to collect this photograph. So, I'm thinking about this sort of idea of a living archive of memory. Who do we remember and why? Who gets to be included in collective memory? Who gets kind of forgotten over time? Those sorts of things to me are political questions as much as they are personal questions, as much as they are social questions. Memory is a political thing, as we are seeing even right now. The reason why these are life size is so that way there's a sort of one-to-one connection between you as the audience member and the painting, the person themselves. There are a couple of things that I'm thinking about with this sort of body of work, and one of them is the sort of act of defacement. So obviously, defacement typically is seen in a sort of violent context. I'm thinking about it in the context of Michael Taussig, who is an anthropologist, and he talks about the act of defacing sacred objects and how it sort of shocks them back into being or makes you notice them, they're piercing and present again. So if we think about the family photograph as this sort of sacred relic or object that has been abandoned or discarded in some way. Painting over instead is more about an act of love, of bringing them to the present moment with us. I work with all kinds of different photographs, with this. To me, funerary images and mourning images are sort of like the hyper encapsulation of this body of work. It's kind of funny, this year it's sort of a year of love, if you will. We're starting with weddings, and then later this fall, which Tim mentioned, I'll be showing at UNC Charlotte, and it'll be a mourning show. So grief to me is another component of love, which is also embedded in family photographs. So in any case, the context of defacement, painting over them is supposed to be this sort of act of love. And so the paint itself is both very physical, as you probably saw in the exhibition. I work with thick paint. This piece is in the Tampa Museum collection, Museum of Art collection. And this one is in the Denver Art Museum collection. And so you can see that there's like thick impasto. I want that sort of physicality on the original image. Well, the image that has been blown up. The color usage for me is sort of denoting this sense of otherworldliness, or we're not actually in a space of reality, if that makes sense. It's sort of this like in between liminal space where these people exist and where they're sort of visiting us for a brief moment. As you can see, in addition to the bright colors, there's also other aspects of these loving acts of care, and some of it is beautification in the context of patterning. So patterning for me is meant to do a few things. It is both to sort of underline relationships and connections that are within the image themselves. It can sort of adjust compositional issues within some vernacular photographs. And then also, of course, adornment and embellishment. This piece right now is up at Utah MoCA's museum until February 22nd, if you are going to Salt Lake City for some reason. So as you can see, my work tends to be a little bit large because it is life-size. In addition to the patterning as adornment and as embellishment, as a connection, as beautification, there's also color washes, I'm sure you've noticed, over some of the faces. For me, this is sort of an element of another aspect of painting as touch, painting as care. I like to think of how if you're obscuring certain elements, it kind of asks you as the viewer to look a little bit closer, sort of like if you hear somebody whispering, you're going to lean in so you can hear a little bit better. So my work I had been wanting to do this for many years and didn't have the studio space to do it. And then finally in 2022, I was able to get a studio that allowed me to start working more three-dimensionally and also with sort of different formats. So started with working with a lot of like mirror frames. This is one of them, for example. It does open and close, as well as framing out the pieces. So for me, a lot of these also are sort of functioning as both portals of connection, as well as these sort of altars to these individuals that are within the photograph themselves. So, thinking about this sort of tension of not quite alive, but also not quite dead, because, as long as we remember someone, they're still alive and living memory. And so even though we're missing the necessary translators who can tell us about the memories of these people, this work is supposed to sort of carry forward these people into the present moment and hopefully beyond. And it's also sort of working with the back and forth of photography and painting. I always like to call them dysfunctional siblings. They're constantly calling each other dead, but they're both so incredibly dependent on each other, both in terms of their history and then also in terms of how they operate now. So, thinking about photography and photo theory specifically, a photograph is a representation of death of a moment. Sometimes when you're looking at the photograph, the person who's in the image may no longer be with us. Whereas painting, time is more dynamic. It's not static. It's kind of all over the map. And that's kind of how I like to think about this body of work. You know, I think most people think of the past in these series of boxes that are very constricted and constrained, instead of this more expansive and boundless way of thinking about time, and that time is not just linear. This was a sort of prototype to the swing piece that you all saw in the show. This work is the first canvas painting that I got to work with. You know, the mirror frames, to go back here very briefly, one of the other things that I really love about them is the history of the object itself. And I'm thinking about that as I'm collecting different objects. You know, in the context of mirrors, it already has this history of looking, but what's happening is typically the owner of the mirror would stand in front of the mirror and see themselves reflected back. But in this case, the mirror glass has been replaced with these people who are looking back at you, and you're having this back and forth projection and connection that's happening. This is one of the pieces that was actually at the UMass Amherst show, Imaginary Homelands, which was a two-person show with Alicia Brown and I, curated by Ann Suth. All right, so that's kind of a brief overview of the Forgetting series. And then, you know, so like I said, I like to think about the work in the context of series within series. So I collect, you know, different moments that I think are sort of important within people's lives, or I'm collecting, you know, people in nature or specific kinds of studio portraiture, certain time periods, all across the map. And so I have been holding on to wedding photographs for a very long time. I think that weddings are a very complex ritual that we undergo. It has all of this baggage, this you know, patriarchal, heteronormative baggage. It also comes with historical baggage and gender and everything. Everything is embedded into this. You know, the photographs that I collect, like I mentioned, is from all over. In this particular case, you know, there's 9 paintings in the show, so that, you know, limits how many can be shown. So most of this work is a lot of Western dress specifically, although the photographs are themselves broadly collected. So, you know, like I said, you know, weddings can be this really complicated day on a good day. And then, you know, also they're about love and commitment. And people have their photograph taken as a way of marking this event. And initially, I had thought about a wedding and funeral show. And the reason being the piece, I'm going to skip ahead. This one was actually sort of the impetus for that thought. If you removed the bride and then pushed in a casket, you would not have to change anything in the room. It would look the same, which I thought was something visually, etc., very interesting. When I decided to not do funerals for this show and just specifically focus on the weddings themselves, and, you know, thinking about sort of the choices that are made in the context of what a wedding portrait is, who is included in these portraits, who gets to be included in these rituals. All of that kind of stuff is sort of embedded in the images that were chosen. So this first one here is a photograph that I sourced from Singapore, and it's of a Chinese couple that were married in Singapore. And as you can see, it includes both the painting itself, so this is on canvas, as well as framing with fabric, embroidery, and tassels and flowers that are stitched on. In this particular piece, there are 721 French knots, 721 French knots, and then 242 flowers that are stitched onto this frame. So, you know, there's a lot of interesting sort of domestic labor that goes into a lot of wedding making and wedding planning. You know, there's the embroidery and the beautification and the dress and the outfits and all of those other things, the flowers. All of those sort of components were things that I was thinking about as I was making this work and wanted to sort of include as sort of nods. Unfortunately for me, that also meant that I had to do all of that stuff. I do want to shout out that I had some really amazing studio assistants throughout, starting with Sylvie Schleen, who helped strip away some of the swing piece. It had been a sofa originally, to Maya Peniel, who helped with a lot of, with some of the embroidery and some of the stitching on of the flowers. Felicity Wababa, who's my current studio assistant, as well as wonderful friends, Toby Wilson and Andy Lester, who have been cheering me on and also participating in some of this. So this has been a lot of, oh, and also my spouse, Henry, who got to learn a new skill of embroidery, which was an exciting adventure for all of us. So this has been sort of a collective labor of love in a lot of ways. So in addition to the physicality of the labor, you know, I mean, when it comes to making large paintings, just in general, they are a very physical, arduous thing. I am a short person, so I am constantly climbing on ladders and benches to make this work. Just the painting portion requires a lot of physical activity. And then to actually make the framing and everything else is its own sort of arduous endeavor. For all of these pieces, the painting happens first, and then the deciding of how they're going to be framed and what they're going to look like. So in the case of the canvas paintings, I'll do like a small little tiny doodle that kind of is a very, very, very rough sketch. And then I sort of select what fabrics to me make sense to each of the individual pieces, and sort of bring them all together and bring all the elements. So for this particular piece, this image was sourced from Bulgaria. And as you can see, and as you saw in the show itself, there is a train of flowers. I like to suffer. I stitched all of those to a bit of tulle, so that way they would have this sort of dynamic quality to them, and also have the language and the fabric of weddings included. In this piece alone, there are 367 flowers. I did all of them. And then, you know, this piece initially was painted in 2020, and then you can cut off, but that's fine. And then wanted to have this really sort of elaborate frame. Unfortunately, for the audiences who are joining us virtually, I did not finish the details for this piece, but they will be on my website in the next week or so. But it was a very ornate frame that also mimicked the colors that are within this specific piece. And you can see kind of the detail that I'm working with. You know, I'm using color washes. I'm working with metallic paint. I'm really interested in surface. I want there to be this sort of dynamic experience as you're looking at the work, that it kind of changes and shifts and moves as you yourself move around it. So, you know, some of these photographs are formal studio portraits. Some of them are sort of vernacular images that are taken. And there are a lot of different reasons for why some are done one way versus another. So, you know, this particular wedding portrait in a parlor, I would guesstimate the time period between 1880s, 1890s to about maybe 1910s, somewhere thereabouts, and is obviously in somebody's home. That elaborate wallpaper behind them was part of the original photograph. And I kind of loved that detail, the streamers and the flowers. And, you know, I think what's really interesting is these photographs and family photographs in general are as much personal and familial documents as they are historical. And it's sort of like a demonstration that our collective memory of the past is so narrow in comparison to what it actually is, so that far more people have existed and participated in certain rituals than what we may think is possible. In this piece, there are 784 French knots. I finished the details today, but I did not get them onto here, but there were a lot of them. This particular piece, this photograph is sourced from Egypt, and I found it to be a very striking photograph. It was one of the first ones that I knew was going to be part of the show. I did crop it in very slightly. As I was mentioning to Tim earlier, there was a chandelier that was kind of half present in the top. But what's really interesting about this one to me is the composition of who's included. I like to leave the interpretation of each piece open. I don't generally say this is how I interpret this work, because I think the audience is as important. You all are sort of activating and completing this work. You're completing this like step of care and connection. To me, if you asked, I kind of saw this as a sort of blended family, that the children on the left side are with the bride, the mother, and then the groom, the father, and the two children on the right are his kids. So it's a joined family together, that I thought was quite lovely. And that's also kind of how I painted it. For this particular piece, there are 153 French knots and 43 flowers. And, I should mention, sorry to go backwards on you all, this particular piece here, this is actually a painted backdrop that was behind them. And it was a sort of moody night scene. That's a moon that it's supposed to be behind them. And then they were all placed in front, which I thought was a really interesting choice for a wedding portrait. And of course, you've got the bride and groom, as well as a small wedding party of a bridesmaid and a groomsman. This was also another painted backdrop. So to continue on, this is another vernacular photograph. I would probably estimate like 1940s, 1950s. This, along with the other queer wedding, had nothing written on the back or the front of the photograph. So the naming, the way that I do titles for this series is if there's anything written on the front or the back of the photograph, that's incorporated in the bracketed title. Otherwise, I come up with the most generic, boring title that is meant to just be simply very descriptive. So this is one of the ones that also did not have that. So, again, thinking about sort of the history and the sort of politics of who is permitted to participate, who is, what sort of histories there are. There's no one capital H history, but so many different histories that not all of us are necessarily privy to, or maybe don't know about in the larger sort of dominant culture narratives, but there's so many more expansiveness behind that. For this piece, it has 98 French knots, 96 flowers that are stitched into the fabric, and then there are 44 that are dangling around it. So I did run out of time. I had 2 planned mirror frame pieces, and that's fine. Sometimes life happens like that. So this is one photograph of an Iranian woman. Funny enough, the Egyptian woman in the blue dress that was in front of all of those flowers, that's about the color of my wedding dress when I was married. I did not do a traditional wedding. And so I liked the idea of this sort of green bride and this old antique Eastlake mirror frame as a sort of completion. This piece is a photograph that was sourced from an eBay seller in Valparaiso, Indiana, but is of a family based in Chicago. And the title, that's the photo company or the group of people that took the photograph and processed it, which I kind of love. There's a Valentine. They're inside of a room. So, thinking about all these like different ways that a wedding portrait can exist and all the different moments that it gets sort of documented. For this particular show, I did not include anything that was like of the actual ceremony or anything like that. I was really interested in these other sort of like presentations of how to present the participants in the wedding. And then the last piece in the show is my first piece that is installed from a ceiling. So a huge learning curve there. So this, this was probably one of the first pieces that I thought about for the show. I found this antique Eastlake sofa that was very beat up on Craigslist. And I thought, it would be fantastic as if, I had the bride and groom portraits where the back seat cushions are, and then had a bed of flowers as the seat. This actually predated the chair piece that I showed you earlier. That chair piece I ended up making just as a testing grounds, but this came first. And, over the course of a year, this piece went from being a very ratty, dinged up, falling apart wooden sofa to what it currently is right now. The photograph is from Venezuela. And you can see some more details here. I did not count how many flowers are in this particular piece. You can use your imagination. I would imagine it's at least 300 to 500. It's probably way more. I cleaned out all of the flowers that I had in my studio basically and this was also the last piece that was completed. Shout out again to Henry for helping me thread all of these flowers into the piece. So, to talk about sort of the enormity of the labor that went into this show, the wonderful thing is Tim gave me this invitation and wanted it to be this open space of experimentation to really push my work. And so I have been thinking about this show for several years since I was invited, and have been slowly working towards expanding the kinds of work that I make. So, when I started framing pieces in 2022, that was with this show already in mind. I was already sort of building towards that. In this show, there are 1,756 French knots and 828 flowers, minus this swing, which it could be 800 on its own, who knows. So, I really wanted to think about, all these sort of different tasks and different elements. In the Forgetting Is So Long series, I like to think that I'm sort of nudging the photographer and their gaze out of the picture and sort of, in a way, sort of inserting my own or the audience's. In this case, I was also the fabricator, the person that was making the beautiful sort of clothing or decorations that go into all elements of a wedding. So I wanted this sort of aspect of, these huge over the top aspects to how weddings are often seen. I personally wanted to elope for my wedding. I didn't, because Venezuelans don't elope, but but as far as like thinking about all of these different sort of like historical and social rituals and how we upend or how we think about how others have done it, so often our imaginations are just so very limited in comparison to what they have been. And of course, this idea of like the white Western bridal dress is such a construct of a very few amount of years. So that's kind of a brief. Hey, I did it. That's kind of a brief overview of the show overall. I really appreciate your time and care and listening to me speak. And I think we can open up for questions if you have any. you can reach me at all the aforementioned. My website is just daisypatton.com. My email is daisy.a.patton@gmail. And then my Instagram is daisy_patton. Thank you so much.
Okay. So thank you, Daisy. I am trying to access the live chat as well, so I can get everybody online who have been posting questions. But I'm going to open up to the floor right now. This room is all live and hot, so you guys can go ahead and just raise your hands and just ask questions of Daisy, and she'll answer them for you. And then as soon for anybody online who asks questions, I will pull them up in a second and get us all squared away on that too. So, are there any questions in the house right now about Daisy or her work? Yeah, please.
Really love seeing the show here. Tim did a wonderful job and it's very exciting to see. I'd like to ask you a question about your process. And to what extent do you have a plan for the photograph? And to what extent are you improvising as you're working on it?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you so much for asking. I usually mention that and missed it. It's a very individual process. So, in the same way of sort of falling in love with the individual and that love sort of sustaining into it being printed and then becoming a painting and hopefully a successful one. And, not all of them are. It's a very sort of open space. So color is, of course, very foundational. So I typically will do a digital color mock-up just to kind of establish color relationships before beginning. But almost always that is a very open sort of color mock-up, other than color washes on the faces and stuff. Everything else, I don't actually know how it's going to sort of come about until the end. So, I often have the color mock-up and then the completed piece, and usually they are color-wise fairly similar. I do make adjustments as I go, but also just radically different because, sometimes I'll have an idea in mind that I know for sure that I want this piece to have a specific look or a specific technique or what have you. And other times it's, me sort of working through the shaggy dog phase of a painting, as I like to call it, that middle where it's, you're past the exciting starting point where everything is new and fresh, and then you're like drudging till you get to sort of the end. Pattern is always the last thing that's incorporated in the painting itself. So sometimes I'll know where the pattern is going to be automatically with photographs. Sometimes I don't know until it's time. And then it's the same way with the framing. Most of the time, I wait until the painting is actually done, and then I start to think about what sort of frame it might be. If it's a paneled piece, then I'll do a digital mock-up of colors to see what makes the most sense before digging right in. But, sometimes those change even as I'm like working on it. So it's kind of a mix. Great question. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I absolutely love all your works in there, it's very bright, colorful. And I wanted to ask you about the sort of like the aura and every person, like what's the choice in the colors, or how do you feel about those choices in the aura, or I don't know if there's a specific term that you use for that.
Yeah, that's a great question too. I've had folks who've asked about like aura specific, and I love all of those sort of open interpretations. I'm usually thinking about bright colors that are not meant to hint at, like, for example, like decay. Like if it was like a kind of muddy green or something like that. It's a bright, vibrant color. And to me, it's supposed to represent this other aspect of otherworldliness, as well as that sort of touch of care. So, to me, and you'll notice in the show itself, all of the work is hung a little bit lower than what is traditional. And it is meant to sort of represent this idea that you could walk into the painting, or the person could walk out. And if they did, if they have color washes, it's almost if they're like these glowing beings in a way. And that's why like hands are so often touched with that sort of glow, and faces. Hands and faces to me are some of the most expressive parts of people, or at least that's what I like to look at. And the same sort of way with all of the floral patterns, like on some level, I imagine that they could walk out of the painting and sort of have all of these botanicals sort of attached to them and part of these like hybrid people or hybrid beings, if you will. Yeah, so I occasionally will look at like aura stuff and find it interesting, but I always immediately forget what all of the colors are supposed to represent. But I think there's something really interesting about like aura photography and like spiritualist photography. I think all of that stuff to me is very deeply fascinating as histories. And those are things that I think about in some of this work, like spiritualist photography is so often about like the dead appearing in a photograph. And of course, it's not actually happening, but this element of grief and like, having these portraits with beloved loved ones who are no longer with us. Thinking about that with this work too is something I find to be very interesting. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing this.
Thank you.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I wonder what kind of bridge occurred when you began to use the fabric loosely around the frame. Some of your frames are, more static. And then you have these portals, these windows or mirrors or whatever. But I wonder what was the launching pad that got you doing these draping kinds of things? What was it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. So initially my thought process when I began, because for a very long time, I was very against working with canvas. As a photo printer, a lot of canvas prints look awful, and I didn't think that they would hold up. But it took a long bit of research. It took me, I originally had this idea in 2020. I didn't start working on it until 2023. So it took I'm one of those kinds of artists that I'm a little bit slow in terms of research and everything else. I want to like really hammer out all of the technical issues. Part of it is when you work really large, you kind of have to. And the initial impetus to work on canvas was thinking about sort of tapestries and Persian rugs and sort of the visual languages and narratives that are embedded in those. Persian rugs are supposed to represent garden. Paradise as a word came from the Persian word for the garden. And then, thinking about like historical tapestries and stuff. So that was the initial starting point. And as I've been working with the drapery and everything else, it also makes me think a lot about the body. Specifically the piece, the wedding portrait of the bride and groom with the train of flowers that has the sort of shape, the dangly shapes that have the flowers dangling off of them. They're sort of meant to almost represent like arms or maybe like tree limbs or something like that. So, they have this sort of aspect of the body. Typically when I talk about my work in general, I mentioned some of, my own personal, in the personal history, I also mentioned while I was in grad school, I went into grad school as a photographer doing street and documentary work, and I left with sound, which is a very SMFA thing to do. But halfway through grad school, I got diagnosed with MS. And that is partially why I am not physically with you right now as a disabled person trying to stay alive in an ongoing pandemic. I think a lot about the body and, it's the effects of like deterioration and memory and our own fragility and mortality. You know, this work has all of those things sort of encompassed inside of it. But it's also like work about joy and beauty, which I think is also very important. And, you know, the corollary with grief being another aspect of love and care. And, you know, I'm very grateful to all of you for attending. You know, like I said, audiences to me are so important. I wish I could be with you because you sort of help complete this project. You know, you're activating and you're continuing this sort of active care and love by sort of having these connections with the work. So yes, so the body, to go back to your original question, it is kind of where I was sort of thinking, but, you know, like I said, the aspect of the language, the visual languages of tapestries and Persian rugs were also very much embedded in there. For this show, you know, thinking so much about weddings and, you know, the huge amounts of flowers and embroidery that's also incorporated into various aspects of the ceremony or dress. I wanted to make sure that that was also included in here too. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Yeah, please.
Thanks for sharing, Daisy. I have a technical question. How do you go from a small photograph and get it printed onto these large canvases so that you can paint on them? Could you talk about that process?
Yeah. So, you know, like I said, I have a background in photo. I have my own scanner, and then I have my own printer. So I do all of the printing and scanning in-house. And, you know, I'm very picky about which photographs. You know, the wedding in the parlor piece was a little blurry, and I was worried that it was not going to work printing wise, but thankfully turned out. It's its own sort of process. I used to do all of the mounting myself onto panels, and then in about 2019 transitioned away from the larger pieces. I used to have like a full crew, all of us working together to mount the print onto wood panels back in the old days. Now I have a fabricator. I literally dropped off prints today for that morning show that's going to be later this fall. And they will mount it onto dye bond, and now I build cradles. So I have a little de facto wood shop in the garage outside of my studio. But for the canvas paintings, that's a whole different ball game. That one I still do in-house, and I have to have multiple people. So it's very much a learning process, and learn as you go and adjust accordingly based on whatever media you're doing. It is a lot of labor, but that's how I do it. I do it myself for the most part. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah, please.
Did you talking about how many flowers was incorporated in the art? And I was curious if you could repeat the number of how many French knots you incorporated.
The French knots, Daisy.
Yes, it was. It was 1,756.
Yeah.
I tried to like keep a sort of running count, which drove everyone bananas because, you know, my schedule last year ran a little lag. I had a show that I wasn't expecting to try to cram in, and so the UMass show went all the way into September, and so I actually only had about 4 months to make this show, which is not a good idea. And so in any case, you know, basically as soon as pieces were completed, I also do all the documentation. So I'm the one that processes all the files. Once I know for sure that it's good, then we packed up the piece. But before we did that, I wanted to make sure that we counted every single thing because I really wanted to be able to both have this for you all to share, and then also, you know, when you first start working on some of these like really arduous pieces, I could not in advance count because I knew that if I knew how many I was going to have to do, it would be too discouraging. So I waited until after it was done to be able to be like, okay, this is how many French knots were in this one. the very first piece had 721 French knots, and I was like, I'm never going to do that again. And then I did 784 on the parlor celebration. So, I like to suffer. And I'm sad that I didn't count how many flowers were in the swing. If someone ever wants to do that, feel free, because there are a lot of them. But yeah, that's a good question.
We might have someone I can charge with that task.
It'll take forever. I'm sorry.
Please, yeah, go ahead.
Could you talk about your relationship with color? Your colors are so bright in your works. Just kind of what's the arc of your personal relationship with color over your life, and what do you think?
Yeah. Well, as you can tell, I love color. To me, I think about color not in the context of like individual symbolism, but rather as sort of evoking an emotional state or a mood. And that's how I sort of build color schemes. To sort of go back to one of the questions about like aura, when I'm looking at a photograph, sometimes a color will come forward that I then build a color scheme around. So, the blue bride, I knew that she was going to have that blue dress, and then sort of built the color scheme around her. And I wanted it, I had two versions, two color mock-up versions. One, she had a pink dress and had different colors around her. And then the one that you see there. And so, some of them have a different sort of emotion or mood that gets evoked. Very rarely will I do multiple color schemes of one particular piece, but lately I've been sort of doing that. And I had to think to myself, what emotionally feels right for the scene and right for the piece, and how people will receive it. Because I do think color has so much of a sensory form of communication that is not just, the sort of like analytical language, but also like, this sort of subconscious or the emotional and all of these other things, which I think that the sort of the history of how we talk about color, Western art history and modernism and everything sees bright colors as being sort of quote unquote primitive, or not part of white dominant culture. It's why you see in a lot of like modernist work, it's very stripped down to like black, white, and red. There's a really great book about this, also by Michael Tosick, and he talks about, I think it was indigo specifically. But I think there's something really interesting about the ways in which we perceive color and how color is seen historically, politically, socially, etc. Like I said, for me, I don't do specific symbolisms. I want it to be this really vibrant, I like to try to push color and color schemes as much as possible, so I'm not just making the same painting over and over again. This body of work, I think, is painting number 280 of the series. And I try to adjust and play with and change as much as possible. The Egyptian family with the two girls, with the four girls, I should say, that piece, I made an initial color mock-up, and then I made several other ones, and then I hated all of them because they felt like they were moody nighttime scenes, or they just didn't feel like they fit. But I ended up going with an alternate one that was a warmer toned one, because I actually did think that made sense for the photograph itself, as well as like how I perceived how the scene should be sort of read, if that makes sense. It's a long way to go around it.
Daisy, I will say that working with you and starting to understand the way in which you approach color is the best way I would put it is you are unafraid to use vividness within your work. You are unafraid to use the most pure pigment palette that we have to get the brightest and most saturated colors that exist. And in doing that, it kind of brings us back into a relationship with color, which is different. It is definitely, it is bold, and it is I often say that your work is devastatingly colorful, because it kind of reminds us of how sapped of color and vibrance a lot of the world around us kind of is. So I think that that's
Yeah.
an interesting question to have.
I love that too. You know, I also like to think of the work in terms of color families, because I'm painting all of the work together at the same time. And, you know, I don't plan out the whole show at once. You know, I'll tackle the individual paintings as I go, and I have to like be really careful that I'm not repeating too much, but I'm usually working on 3 or 4 paintings at the same time. And inevitably that means that I'm going to be toning or playing with the same color on different pieces. So they're all sort of like connected together. I sort of think of paintings that get all painted together as a sort of little family too. Color is another like connective tissue, if you will. Yeah.
All right, I think we have time for one last question, then we need to wrap it up for everybody. Is there any last questions in here? Any questions in the chat? Awesome. Okay, I'm gonna try and do our wrap up here where I get to talk to everybody and everybody gets to see me. First of all, I want to thank Daisy for doing this with us tonight. Thank you so much, Daisy.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so grateful.
Let me see if I can make this work so everybody can see me too.
And thank you so much for all of your questions. They were really, really great. I very much enjoyed all of them. So thank you for your attentiveness and care. Yeah, I love it. Thank you.
Here, hopefully it's super. All right, so thank you all so much for coming. I'm gonna do all my thank yous now. This is what I do at the end of artist talks. So first of all, I want to thank Daisy for working with me to put this exhibition together. As a curator and as a person who runs the gallery, I can't make any shows happen without the amazing and hard work of artists like Daisy. We do our best to support them, but it's their creative capital that makes the show happen. So thank you so much, Daisy. I also want to thank the Harold J. Miossi Charitable Trust for endowing the gallery and allowing us to have an operating budget that allows me to do amazing things like bring artists from Massachusetts and across the world and artists like Daisy into the gallery for the students and the community here at Cuesta. I also want to thank Cuesta College for housing the Harold J. Miossi Art Gallery and being a wonderful institution that supports such an amazing center of creative life here in San Luis Obispo. It's really a gift to be part of it. I want to thank Magnolia Stork, who does everything that you don't see happen in the gallery. She makes it happen. She pays all of our artists and she makes the gallery run. She is invaluable to us. And I also want to thank Bo Burnham. He is our prep and he is the reason why all the artwork is up on the walls and why that swing is so beautifully hanging in the middle of the gallery. This is an amazing show. It's up for about 6 weeks. It runs through March 14th, and I want to welcome you all to come on back and see it again and tell your friends about it. It's wonderful. The next show we have coming up in the gallery is our big celebration of the year, which is our student annual, where we get to celebrate Cuesta students for their excellence in the arts, and that will open on April 17th. So look forward to seeing you all there. Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.